It's an Archaeodeath Interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Welcome, Archaeodeathlings, to another Archaeodeath interview with a familiar face. It's Andy Brockman back again, and this time we're continuing the story of this complex relationship of archaeology, heritage, and mortality through particularly conflict archaeology and heritage. And we've been exploring all these. This move at Andy's career from investigator to investigative journalist, and challenging the practices ongoing. And we've reached a point where we want to delve into perhaps the story that I perhaps have heard most about over the years, and I'm intrigued to hear more about, which is Spitfires in Burma, or the Burma Spitfire. I don't even know how to. There's a book. um, Andy, welcome back, and pick up the story, please. So, why is this such an important case study, do you think, for what you've been doing?
Well, I think it encompasses many of the things that we spoke about in our previous conversation. So I think it's worth taking it as a sort of case study and a standalone, really. So because it deals with all the relationships that we talked about previously in terms of as archaeologists, heritage professionals, with cultural artifacts, with popular culture, with the law, with politics, and with the media, and perceptions and maybe misperceptions. And you were kind enough to mention the book earlier on that we wrote about the whole project. I might even get around to plugging it later if you'll let me. But in all seriousness, from the get-go, I have to say that there really should be two of us on this conversation, and that's my co-author and the project manager on the Burma Spitfires project for wargaming.net, Tracy Spate. Unfortunately, Tracy died in November last year, 2023, and we miss him greatly. But the project wouldn't have happened without his input. So I want to acknowledge that from the get-go.
Sincere condolences to you and their friends and family for yeah. So on one level, it's fitting that we're having this conversation now, but also a tragic moment in that sense in recent events.
That's right. I mean, shall I just sort of pitch in with how the story began for me, and then you can you can pick up where and follow up any highways and byways that you want to. And again, people watching this may well have, if not remembering direct knowledge, have a vague memory that in the spring of 2012 a story went viral, first of all in the UK media and then around the world, about a claim that the Royal Air Force had buried Spitfires in what was then Burma, what's now Myanmar. And the story varied. It was either in 1942 when the Japanese were invading, or in 1945 at the end of the war. Accounts differed, and that becomes a leitmotif of the whole story. But essentially, my first involvement with it was a colleague rang me up on a Saturday morning and said, "Have you seen the story in the Daily Telegraph?" And it turned out that the Daily Telegraph actually had a direct relationship with the people who were promoting the idea that these Spitfires had been buried, in particular a Lincolnshire farmer called David Gundle. Rod Scott, who's another conflict archaeologist, a good friend and colleague, rang me up and said, basically, this is nuts because we've seen this story before. It's about sort of big, juicy cultural artifacts that were left behind at the end of the war that are there for people to go out and find, and they're usually worth a lot of money. If you go to East Anglia, it's stories about Harley Davidson motorbikes. If you go to RAF Culloden near Bristol, it's a buried Lancaster bomber at the end of the runway. And these stories are often based on sort of a folk memory of things that were actually done at the end of the war. So, for example, RAF engineers did smash up unwanted bits of kit and bury them in holes. and often they'd set fire to them. And they're regularly found, and in fact, there's even a subset of metal detectorists who go out looking for these things. But occasionally, these stories get absorbed into the classic lost treasure trope that we can follow right the way through history. And so our immediate thought was, well, that's probably what's happened here, because the idea of complete aeroplanes being buried in their crates on an airfield, why would you do it? It's a very difficult thing to do. So it would leave a paper trail, and there was no paper trail. It would leave photographs. There are no photographs. And so I've finished the conversation and thought about it a bit, and I actually then wrote an article for Heritage Daily, Marcus Milligan's website, which I was writing for at the time, where I basically said, this is a fascinating story, but it's probably, it's highly dubious. At the same time, never say never. Prudent archaeologist never says never. And so if there is going to be a search for these aircraft, please let's do it archaeologically. Let's not just send in the big yellow trowel, the 360, with digger, and just lam into the ground. Let's do this properly, with proper documentary work, proper field work, proper conservation in place, and so on, so that we can get as much knowledge out of this, what would be a remarkable event, as we possibly can. And a few weeks later, I was contacted by a production company in New York, based in New York, which was headed up by a man called Mark Minucci, who's done a lot of films for Nat Geo, and so he's got a strong track record in producing documentary TV. He'd been commissioned by wargaming.net, who were now supporting this thing, to make a documentary about the story. And after various conversations, I was commissioned to do some primary research for them, and to basically fact check what they've been given. And that's when I met also with Tracy, who was running the project for Wargaming, which at the time was one of the, and it still is a major company, but at the time it was famous for running in particular an online multiplayer game called World of Tanks. And part of the social benefit that the company was trying to put back from the money they'd made out of World of Tanks was to do historical research and historical projects. They were working with a number of museums at the time, including the USS Iowa in the States and the Tank Museum down at Bovington. So, and the upshot of those conversations and the research I did was to say, on the initial trawl, based on the evidence that they'd given me, that they'd been supplied by David Kundle and others, and they had another researcher, Megan Harbath, who'd been working at the RAF Museum, and the story was looking decidedly iffy. So, and at this point, we're all working under the shadow of a press conference, press release from David Cameron, who was then the UK Prime Minister, who had just visited Myanmar as leading a delegation from the European Union, because back in the day we were part of international politics, and but Cameron was under some pressure on this trip around the Far East, in fact, where he'd taken basically a plane load of journalists and industrialists and entrepreneurs. It was all about boosting, making Myanmar part of the world again, really, after decades of appalling military dictatorship. I'll maybe talk about a little bit about that in a minute. But also, obviously, helping the bottom line of UK PLC. But Cameron was under pressure because they'd chartered an airliner from a Nigerian oil company, owned by a Nigerian oil company, that at the time was under investigation by the United Nations for massive money laundering. So I'd say subsequently they were cleared. They were cleared.
Of course.
But of course, absolutely. Yeah. You might think that I can possibly comment. But at a press conference in Yangon, Cameron announced that he had been negotiating with the president of Myanmar for a joint project to recover these aeroplanes and have at least some of them returned to the UK. And David Cundall released a statement saying that he looked forward to a squadron of newly restored Spitfires flying down the Mall and over Buckingham Palace and things like that. It was a sort of flag waving exercise, waving Britain's probably leading, certainly 20th century cultural icon. And it was the story was carried in the Guardian by Nick Watt, who's now the political editor of Newsnight. Loads of other press people picked it up, and the story went viral around the world. So we've got this huge media spotlight on us, and I'm in the position of telling the company that's sponsoring it, and in for 7 figures, and the film company, that what they thought they bought into probably isn't what they bought into. Father Christmas doesn't exist, and and really, yeah.
How naive that they. I mean, can I just say? I'm just the archaeological illiteracy of thinking that. I mean, I don't know the range of metals that compose a Spitfire, but I think various steel, iron alloys, might be at least part of it. I mean, these things do rust. Have they heard of rust? I mean, I don't know. It just seems to. I know it's not all iron, but that. But I mean,
it's better than that. Again, if you're not a specialist in the archaeology of World War II and aviation archaeology in particular, you won't be aware of the term in archaeology, DAS. If you remember, DAS is a soap powder, and it's sort of yellowy greeny colour, and it's what people in aviation archaeology call aviation grade aluminium alloys from the 1940s, which have been buried in the ground and basically degraded. Turned into this sort of horrible, sort of sludgy, greeny powder. I think the thing that I always say to people, don't be too hard on the media. I think I mentioned it in our previous conversation. A lot of people in the media who do this kind of work aren't specialists. They rely on people like us to explain things like that. And if they don't ask us for whatever reason, whether it's time, budget, or they don't want someone to spoil the story, you get the response that you've just alluded to.
Sorry, I just had. As I said, I'm not an expert myself in militaria and its components, but just my default assumption is that in a rich biological context of jungle soil, I don't think it's going to. I mean, and also by analogy with other military I've seen in other parts of the Pacific and discussed in other parts of Southeast Asia. Anyway, that's not really the point. Let's move.
No, I mean, the thing is, by sort of late summer, autumn of 2012, everybody's in a position, Wargaming in a position of having to do a go no go on the film and the project, and what are they going to do? And so that they're already, exposed around the world as being involved in this thing. There's me, and I've brought on board as well, again, my colleagues, Rod Scott and then Martin Brown, as one of the best field archaeologists I know, to head up a field project which we've been asked to put in place by Wargaming. And I think, to their eternal credit, and yes, they got millions of hits out of it and so on, but they could have just backed away. But they said, no, we want to follow this up. It's a great story, however it turns out. And we want to come to a conclusion based on the best possible historical research and science. And so they basically gave us the green light to do the field work in Myanmar. Now, the other thing that's going on there is that if this story had broken a year before, ethically, I couldn't have taken part because, and I think most of my colleagues would have agreed on that, because at that time, Myanmar was still the military dictatorship, which very sadly it's reverted to again since the coup, 3 years ago now.
I've lost track, but yeah.
But at that time, there was, albeit imperfect, but an elected government. Aung San Suu Kyi had been released from house arrest, and although she wasn't allowed to take up the leadership of the country, she was in Parliament, and we were able to. The National League for Democracy, which was the organisation that had fought against the dictatorship, and which again, it's more controversial now because of what happened in Rakhine province and so on. But certainly at the time, Aung San Suu Kyi was a national hero and a world hero. She was seen as a sort of Mandela type figure, and she had said, "World, come and engage with us now. Fix our democracy. Embed our democracy. Help us embed our democracy." So that gave us the green light to actually get involved in a project in Myanmar as well.
Okay.
And the Americans and the EU have lifted sanctions and things like that. So again, these ethical problems that as archaeologists maybe we don't always have to think about, but in certain places perhaps we do. But cut to the chase. We fetch up on Yangon International Airport, which used to be RAF Mingladon, in the first week in January in 2013, with a Burmese partner called STP, who are providing us with a workforce and a brilliant project manager, Pei Win, a fixer who the film company have hired, Shui, who again, brilliant person, who'd actually was one of the students who protested against the military government and spent time in prison, and actually wasn't allowed onto the airfield with us because he had a record in Myanmar, although he was working for us as a translator and a fixer. The film crew, David Kundle, a Burma veteran who David had quoted, and Stanley Coombe, who'd been in the British Army in Myanmar, in Burma in 1945 and then 1946. And we're tasked with investigating this particular story. And one of the tools we've got, and again, it's one of the reasons I want to talk about it from an archaeological point of view. David Kundle had quoted some geophysics. Now, he'd hired a geophysicist who was then at the University of Leeds, who had done work on an earlier visit, which had been stopped by the Burmese military. Adam Booth, who's now Dr. Adam Booth, and has worked at Imperial and is back at Leeds, and is now a very experienced geophysicist, with particularly working on things like climate change and glaciers. Adam was also working with another geophysicist from Leeds called Dr. Roger Clark, who and the work that they had done and sort of refereed suggested there might be things going on under the ground, but certainly weren't, as Roger put it at a press conference for us, they weren't a Spitfire detector. But David also quoted another set of geophysics, which he commissioned privately from somebody else, which he claimed exactly that for. He showed some vaguely Spitfire nose engine shaped blobs that were supposedly sat under the ground in this particular part of the airfield. And of course, which images and which opinion was picked up by the media? It turned out, in fact, that, and again, I'm not going to name them here, but the company that he'd used, I'd actually come across before, and I also asked several other colleagues who'd also come across them before, and basically the person who ran it wasn't a trained geophysicist. He was actually an agent for a German company that sold the kit. But he was able to sell his services to various people, including people in the aviation archaeology business, which is how I come across him on a previous project, on a Spitfire crash site here in Woolwich, when what he'd identified as as metallic remains of the aircraft actually turned out to be a Victorian gas main. Now, that's a mistake that any geophysicist can make, but the perils of overclaiming before you've ground truthed, I think, are evident in that particular part of the story. And it's something that's very common, I think, in if we stretch it more widely. If you look at, for example, the recent row about the paper about the Indonesian quote marks pyramid that Graham Hancock has claimed, and then there was a recent paper in a peer-reviewed journal claiming that this was supported by evidence, when in fact very quickly it was shown to be highly dubious. So this is something I think as archaeologists we have to be aware of. It happens, and we have to be very, very careful. But anyway, cut to the chase. Stanley Coombe had claimed that he was in an army truck crossing the field in the spring of 1946, and that he'd seen aircraft he'd seen big boxes and earthworks. And
what else could it be?
What else could it be? Well, this is the thing, and again, witness evidence, whether it's contemporary or whether it is from documents and accounts from the past. I think anybody who does police investigations will tell you. And again, I've been involved in police investigations. But what somebody tells you is the last thing you believe. When somebody tells you something, you say, okay, how can I corroborate what this person is telling me? What independent evidence have I got that this happened? It's it's why if more than one suspect, they're kept apart so they can't compare stories.
Yes. Yeah.
And although we are utterly convinced that Stanley, who was a wonderful man to meet, and it was very moving to hear his account of being a young squaddy in the war in Burma, 19, 20, 21 years old, thousands of miles away from home in Sussex. But his account, and his basic account, we believe he saw boxes and earthworks on the airfield, and then the next day he spoke to an RAF. He was on a different part of the airfield, and he spoke to an RAF guy who he bumped into. He said, "Oh, by the way, what's going on over there? I was, like, what's in those boxes that I can see? So these are big boxes on the far side of the airfield." And the RAF guy says, "Ah, you know what they are, mate? Spitfires." And that, it turns out, was the foundation story of the whole thing that went down through 70 plus years. It went through the world's media, and ultimately had 10 Downing Street saying they were going to get involved in this project. And it also turned out that when we spoke to Stanley in detail, and Rod in particular had lots of chats with him, because Rod's a soldier, been in the army, he was able to talk to him like a soldier, and maybe have a conversation that somebody like me, as an academic archaeologist, trained archaeologist, and couldn't have. And it turned out, and Stan told us at one time, we put the story to him that David Cundall and David Cundall supporters have been putting about the RAF burying these Spitfires, and that Stanley had seen the Spitfires being buried. And it turned out, first of all, he never said he'd seen Spitfires being buried. He just said he'd seen big boxes and earthworks being undertaken, and then the next day an RAF guy told him they were Spitfires. And then he said, I think it was really telling, rather maybe he said, I'm only going by what somebody else told me. This whole edifice was built on to put it kindly, misinterpretation of what Stanley had said, and then people hearing what they wanted to hear ever after. And to cut to the chase, we did proper geophysics with Roger and with Adam. We were able to ground truth the layout of the airfield at the time, which we confirmed with air photographs. We were able to, we located what we believe was at least one foxhole or slit trench, possibly dating from either the defence of the airfield in 1942 by the British Army, or maybe during the Japanese period when the Japanese occupied the airfield. But Martin Brown, leading the intrusive field work, was able to show that where David had claimed the Spitfires were buried, and he'd never looked there before, and was really grateful that we were looking there, had actually been turned over before. We actually proved that by finding a plastic carrier bag in the spoil. And Room 608, the production company, their researchers turned out information and even photographs showing that David had actually been working on the airfield on numerous occasions. His attitude was, to quote somebody who was there at the time, dig, dig, dig. If the Spitfires aren't there, we have to dig deeper. And basically the whole thing was an astonishing piece of, a mixture of wishful thinking. I still harbour suspicions there were elements of a deliberate hoax. I'm not accusing David of that, but we discuss in the book that there are the way certain people presented evidence at certain times were it was a deliberate it was a deliberate hoax. The difficult thing for us was that our Burmese partners, STP, again, because of the political and economic culture, they had bought into this thing. They had been dealing with the highest levels of the Myanmar government, right up to ministerial level. Right, and so when this whole house of cards collapsed, and we tried to give them the softest landing we could, but when this whole house of cards collapsed, obviously they lost a lot of face. And in fact, afterwards, they said, actually, we still believe David. We were probably looking in the wrong place, and we know that work was undertaken subsequently. Although I think it's now the case that certainly the Myanmar authorities have basically got sick of the whole thing, because all of the areas that David searched are now pretty much covered with blacktop. They're part of Yangon International Airport, so nobody's going to be digging there again. But I think in terms of the lessons to draw from it as archaeologists,
all the broader implications, that's something interesting, isn't it? It's a one-off, but it's an exceptional project, but it's not without parallel.
And in fact, it's absolutely not without parallel. And when Trace and I came to write the book, we picked up on a thread that was given us actually by Gavin Longhurst, who's another senior exec at Wargaming, who pointed out to us that something very similar had happened in Jerusalem at the turn of the century, when a British archaeologist, a British army officer had linked up with a Finnish poet and mystic and a French archaeologist, pioneering French archaeologist in what was then the Ottoman Palestine. And they had excavated in Jerusalem, including absolutely illegally, and it caused a riot under the what's now the Al-Aqsa Mosque, looking for the treasures of Solomon and the menorah. And there were so many parallels in terms of there were investors, there was an amateur enthusiast looking for something they really wanted to find. There was a mystic researcher who was quoting documents that nobody else had ever seen or would ever see. And the the politics of it as well. So what goes around comes around. What history repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. Well, there were riots in Jerusalem as a result of that expedition. Thankfully, as I said at the time, the only thing that got hurt in Myanmar really is that there was a few reputations which were recoverable and Wargaming's bank account. But as I say, I'm really pleased and grateful to them that they allowed us to show our working. We didn't just say this is bullshit. This is ancient aliens grade bullshit.
Yeah.
Because we were say, look, here's our working. This is what's being claimed. This is what evidence you'd need to prove that claim. The proof isn't there. It didn't happen. Or it certainly didn't happen in the way that it's being described. It's still possible that, again, like in England, like in other places, there's a folk memory among the people who were service personnel at the time who came back and they described burying stuff after it was being destroyed. I found a document in the National Archive in Kew which described exactly what was happening to the Spitfires on Mingledon at the time they were claimed to be being buried.
Oh yeah.
And in fact, they were and they were being given to the new Indian Air Force, or they were being given to the French in French Indochina.
Oh.
Yeah.
We have a rationale of where they did go. Yeah.
Exactly. There's a complete rationale where they did go. And an aircraft that the RAF wanted to get rid of, that it didn't want to give to the French or the Indian Air Force, were being broken up on the site, over 1,000 of them. And the metal was being sold off on the local scrap metal market. And in fact, an RAF officer put a little jokey little note on the record, in the official record, saying that they were being turned into woks for sale in the local market because the housewives of Rangoon were short of food utensils after the Japanese occupation. So again, we've got this wonderful sort of cultural story, and Rod as well pointed out we found another record book where an RAF junior officer was court-martialed because he lost a flare pistol. And as Rod put it, in the military, if you lose a piece of kit, you get into trouble.
Yes.
If you've signed for something and then can't hand it back, you're in trouble. If you sign for one Spitfire, let alone 36, and you suddenly can't produce the records of what's happened to them, you're in real trouble. The whole thing. The moment you touched it, the whole house of cards collapsed. But because people wanted to believe it, and because it was about Spitfires, this beautiful, kinetic sculpture, as it's been described. I think Jonathan Glancy, the art critic, described the Spitfire as a perfect Art Deco kinetic sculpture. I ended up actually having one of the privileges of my life. It was wonderful to visit Myanmar at that time, and it was a brief window of light and hope, and unfortunately it's been closed again. And all of us who have any connection with the country hope it at some point that chance will come again, but at the moment obviously it's looking very dark.
And thank you, that's a really insightful review. And I would love to ask just about this issue of the cachet of the Spitfire, because at one level you say it's a lost treasure trope that is. Another level, it's a profoundly iconic military piece of kit, or whether it's a ship. It doesn't have to be a specific Spitfire. It doesn't have to be a specific. It's an icon in itself as part of the aviation history of British and related air forces, and therefore it's kind of. It's the coalescence of that, isn't it? The treasure trope and the hyper iconic or super iconic, aeroplane, and that the idea of both things could be just like a sort of a miraculous hidden cave, you know, massive, huge vaults with these planes still surviving, just captures the imagination, doesn't it? In a way that very few, you know.
It does, and again, part of the research for the project, and again, one of the ethical issues for us was, okay, Spitfires have a commercial value. A fully restored Spit at the time, if you wanted to buy one, and this is just to buy one, not run it, would cost you north of £2 million. And there are companies that specialise in renovating Spitfires and turning Spitfires and bits of Spitfires into flying Spitfires. They are an in-demand big boys toy.
Okay.
And you know, we had to say, okay, you know, if you know, if these things were sold, how closely would we want to be identified with the commercial exploitation of archaeological and cultural heritage? In fact, we were satisfied that they weren't going to be there, so the ethical issue wouldn't arise, but we were prepared to sort of answer it. And the answer was going to be, well, look, you know, like I said in the original article, we needed to get what information we could out of this, and what other people choose to do, we're not in control of that.
Yeah,
we're taking a day rate, we're not on a profit share, you know. We've got we're not going to make anything out of this, so therefore we can legitimately work on it as work on the project as archaeologists. And certainly, you know, we weren't pushing any of the you know, the commercial angles. You know, these airplanes are worth millions and they'll bring so many jobs to, you know, there was talk of Virgin Atlantic sponsoring and things like that at the time. So, you know, but you're right. This is, again, it's one of those, it's a bit like metal detecting, you know, where the shiny that is culturally so important, but often, particularly in the popular media, it's the shiny aspect that takes precedence. I mean, you'll be obviously very familiar with that problem with your work in the early Med. You know, it's where a lot of you know, material and hoard material derives from. Staffordshire hoard being the most famous.
Yes, of course.
But yeah, I mean, it's I think I do want to touch, because again, this is, you know, it's an Archaeodeath chat we're having, and I wanted to touch as well on the other reason we felt we had to be involved, and remained involved. And again, I'm you know, very grateful that Wargaming saw this point of view. But when I wrote the project design, I was very keen to emphasize that, first of all, the archaeology that we were going to look at, although we might not be in control of where the actual sites were, we'd recommended some sites, but the on the basis of the, you know, maps and plans and photographs.
Yeah.
But the priority was to look at, for Wargaming, was to look at the sites David claimed the aircraft were buried. But we were working on a military airfield that had been fought over and heavily bombed between late 1941 and June of 1945. And we had the RAF and USAAF bombing records and so on. The place was plastered, so it was the potential for both unexploded ordnance, but also human remains. You know, if an air raid shelter or a slit trench had been hit or something like that, it was highly likely that we could, and if we came and we excavated, it's highly likely we come across human remains. So we made sure that written into our project design and the protocols was how we would deal with that, whether they were of any nationality, whether it was, you know, RAF, British military, Commonwealth military, you know, Empire military, or Japanese, or civilians, local civilians. You know, we made sure that it was clear that we were there for everybody and not just for the shiny.
So in terms of the broader implications, we have the idea of the tropes that draw people in, but also we have the lessons of practice, that being involved in these projects isn't necessarily a compromise if you can steer them away from, you know, misinformation and disaster, even if it is to scupper the project itself. There is a potential here for being ethical within a world that has many pressures to not be ethical. Is that a fair thing to say?
That it's a very fair thing to say, and I said I might try and plug the book later. I will plug the book now. I mean, this is Yeah, no, I mean, this is the book that Tracy and I wrote, and the reason we wanted to do it so much, and then Tracy in particular, it was very much his project at Wargaming. I came on board much later. It was already underway. I was just lucky to be in the right place at the right time. But Trace was a historian and a historian of science by training, and he was adamant that he wanted to get this story out there in the public domain so that it was an example of what can happen and what questions you need to ask. And we went back to looking at the history of science and science communication, and that, I mean, the famous quote from Carl Sagan, the American astronomer, about extraordinary claims needing extraordinary evidence, which again, the producers of Ancient Aliens and program strands like that have clearly forgotten if they ever knew it or ever cared about it.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I ever did. Yeah.
You know, and obviously we wanted, and we told it as parallel stories as well. We told our story. We told the story of the excavations in Jerusalem looking for the lost treasures of Solomon, which is very like, you know, in the history of archaeology, it's a very similar arc, if you like. And then also we told a fictional story, which was basically to satirize the, in a kind way. I mean, you know, but satirize the generation who grew up watching, you know, the Dam Busters and Reach for the Sky and the Guns of Navarone and things like that, who never had that war to fight. They were never able to sit in the cockpit of the aircraft and be a knight of the air. You know, it was you know, they had to live that cultural trope vicariously, and I think that's a lot to do with how this came about. People wanted it to be true because it was Spitfires, because it was the British in World War II. You know, the British in World War II. It was the last time we stood alone against the world, apart from the Empire, the United States, the Soviet Union, and so, you know,
well, only people of matter stood standing against the world.
Yeah, but you know, we wanted to sort of satirize and just show, as well as the archaeological tropes that were going on and the historical tropes that were going on.
Yeah.
The whole story was tied up with sort of fictional tropes, and there was talk of secret files and MI6 and so on in the story. You know, Martin and I were accused of being MI6 stooges who were there to ensure that the cover-up continued.
Oh,
utterly,
yes.
Utterly
That's what
bizarre.
I'm doing.
Yeah. Oh. Well, then I found out. I mean, the person who was linked to it most was Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was, you know, one of the history's greatest self-publicists, but no relation as far as I'm aware. But it turned out that one of his aides in the Far East in 1945 was a naval officer whose surname was Brockman. So, you know,
oh, I knew it.
Exactly. It's a you know, I can only tell you this. I'll have to shoot you afterwards. Yeah, I'll have to shoot you afterwards. But yeah, absolutely. We're hereditary members of the security services. No, I mean, but no, seriously, it was that level of weirdness that was starting to go on, but we wanted to sort of satirize that. So we created a sort of spoof Ian Fleming, excerpts from a spoof Ian Fleming type novel that was supposedly written by one of the special operations executive officers who'd been involved in this cover-up, to show basically the level of the number of people that would have known about it. You'd have to ensure stayed silent, to, you know, for it to actually, for the cover-up to actually work. You know, it was never a runner.
They know. Yeah.
That exactly. And again, I mean, just to finish, I mean, I did a and again, it's particularly, I think, pertinent at the moment, you know, disinformation across our lives. I'm not just talking about archaeology now. We're hearing about a lot about disinformation in our general lives, particularly as we're going into election years in the States and here in the UK. And I read a lot of, I mean, again, more papers about psychology and the psychology of memory than I ever thought I'd read as an archaeologist. And, you know, there's some quite interesting and quite disturbing, actually, statistics in that. I mean, again, views vary, but one possibility is that around 20% of the population is prone to absorbing disinformation unquestioningly and swallowing it. And there's I think it's a growing recognition as well that when people do swallow the Kool-Aid, that actually arguing with them directly is really, there's not much point. You're not going to change their minds. They're either one of that part of that population who is susceptible to that kind of thought pattern becoming embedded in their mind, or they're basically grifters who are earning a nice living, thank you very much, punting this ball. And you're not going to, they're not going to admit that. So often, and I think, again, I'm referencing this back to the Graham Hancock series on Netflix last year, and or year before last now actually, and programs like that, Ancient Aliens and so on. The best, and what we must do as archaeologists and heritage people, if we've got these stories that are being traduced, these ethnicities, these people whose cultures and history are being traduced by these people, by it being suggested that these people weren't capable of building these fantastic monuments. They had to have been helped by aliens.
Yeah.
Those sort of racist colonialist tropes. That the information, well, first of all, while we might not argue with them directly, the information's out there in the public domain for people to find who want to find it and whose minds are capable of being changed. And that it's there in the public domain in a way that's free to access, in a language that I always describe as talking human, not like an archaeological monograph.
So in terms of where we go next then, Andy, you think we've got to be simply wary of, being drawn in, but beyond, that we all have the potential getting enthusiastic about a king under a car park, a pub under a car park, a pub or a Viking ship under a pub, under a car park, or whatever it may be. We all have the potential. Oh, sorry, perhaps that's too specific for certain projects, but no, but seriously, we have, some of those prove to actually find things, but my point is whether there is actually results or not, we've got to be careful about how it's being spun, how it's being manipulated, and we're all potential facilitators or enablers, if not advocates, for this kind of sort of misinformation driven by a mixture of delusion and wishful thinking, I suppose.
Absolutely. I mean, the king in the car park's a great case study in something absolutely remarkable that nobody would have predicted.
No.
And obviously we now know, again, talk about spin, that there has been some pretty heavy duty spinning from both sides of that story.
No.
I'm not going to go there in this conversation, but
no.
I think that the lesson for us all as archaeologists is that we always should work in the public domain. We are recovering information, gathering knowledge, and then through every platform that we have, including things like we're doing now, but we're making our knowledge and our thoughts, our opinions, our own spin, if you like, but we're hopefully in good faith making making that work available. And and that's how it has to be. The moment you start hiding information, and again, this happened in Burma Spitfires. The information was allegedly held back because it was commercially sensitive. In fact, it was about it was documents that were publicly available in the National Archive at Kew.
Right.
But that was the kind of thing we were having to deal with. And so I think it was, I can't remember if I mentioned it to you in a previous conversation or not, but I mean, I see our role as archaeologists being something like the Anderson Cooper, the American journalist on CNN. He has a section in his nightly political show called Keeping Them Honest, where they fact check something that a politician has said or done. And I think as archaeologists, one of our roles is to keep heritage world honest. And sometimes that means keeping our colleagues honest.
Well, I think that's the best point to leave hanging for, and watch this space for all other stories in 2024. It can be,
Yes.
no. I'm seriously, it's an ongoing challenge and an interesting phenomenon, and I think you're doing great work and have done great work in speaking truth to power and being, honest about the challenges we all face in working in this increasingly pressured and the demands on us for results, the demands on us to buy into particular agendas or particular narratives. Just how much Stonehenge is going to be destroyed or restored, or depending on your spin, whatever it may be. I think there's so many ways in which we, as academics and professionals, and we end up finding ourselves having to compromise or finding ourselves with an ethical dilemma, and it seems to be on the monthly at the moment for me. But it's a fascinating topic, Andy. I really appreciate you sharing both in the previous our previous discussions and in this one so many important insights. And where can people find you again, Andy?
Well, you can find me on X Twitter at Pipeline News. I think I've changed the handle recently because I also operate on Blue Sky.
Oh yes,
because of the and I operate under my, actually the easiest one to find is on Blue Sky because I operate under my own name, Andy Brockman.
okay.
But the Pipeline website,
Yes.
all the contacts are on there, and obviously the on the watching brief with Mr. Soup himself, the Archaeo Soup watching brief YouTube channel. And again, if I may just, if anyone does want to find out more about the Buried Spitfires of Burma, the book Buried Spitfires of Burma: A Fake History from History Press, is still available from that bloody international thing that's destroying bookshops. But if you can order it through your local bookshop or one of the websites that supports local bookshops, please do. But it's still out there, and it goes into much more detail on the kind of stuff I've been talking about in this chat.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's been fabulous.
Thank you, and it's been a lot of fun, and thanks for giving me so much time. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk again soon.
Follow Archaeodeath on WordPress, or you'll never learn.